It's a real pleasure to welcome Brenda Maher, the CEO of St John Ambulance, to the Caring CEO. Welcome, Brendan.
It's nice to be here, Graham.
What does care in the workplace mean to you?
That is a good question. Look, from my perspective, it means genuinely seeing people as humans first, and not just your staff or employees. So, taking a real interest in who they are, understanding that everyone's juggling something outside of work that affects how they show up. And I think really about creating a space that puts health and family, as a priority. I mean, work's always going to be here, and we'll always find a way to keep things running if staff need to prioritize, life, family, health. I think it's about also ensuring we've got real strategies around well-being and not just lip service, and
Mm.
that that starts with I guess benchmarking, how people are doing and continually measuring things, not always through a survey, but listening to what they say, acting on it, and ultimately building and maintaining a culture where people feel safe, where they
Mhm.
feel supported, where they feel valued. Because if we get that right, kind of everything else follows.
Very much so. And our listeners should know that we worked together for, I guess, about 6 years at Are You OK, where I was on the board and you were the CEO. And I can certainly reassure everyone that, you really live and breathe that. You do have a very human-centered approach. What is some ways, have you looked at ways to monitor that sort of stress level in a quantitative way, or has it mainly just been about gut feel, looking around, checking people out?
Yeah, look, it's probably both. I mean, we have an annual, sort of workplace culture piece, which isn't just it's externally facilitated. There's a survey component, but there's also one-on-one interviews with every staff member, which gets a real sense of where we're at and where the I guess the soft points are and the things that we need to focus on. But, bringing this up regularly through team meetings, management meetings, we really try and address well-being as a core part of how we do business here, Graham. Yeah.
Mm, mm. I know it's a little bit of an unusual structure at St John, a bit of a federated model, is that right? So you have individual states, but you're the head office. And how do you interact?
Yeah, well, any federated structure, you kind of look at and go, "Well, why would you build an organisation like this?" We saw federation work, in some ways really well in Australia as
Mm.
our state and territory structure in helping us navigate the pandemic, depending on who you're talking to. Yeah, so the Australian office or the Australian Priory, our states and territories operate under a license agreement to the Australian office. They've all got operational sovereignty. They're all complicated and different businesses. In Western Australia, for instance, and the Northern Territory, St John run the public ambulance service, which is, and I think in WA, that's the single largest geographic ambulance service in the world. So they're big,
Right.
complex businesses, and we've got a very, very good culture within what we call the National Leadership Group, which are my state and territory peers at a CEO level, and we operate under agreed minimum standards, and we hold each other to account with respect to how we serve the community and what we expect from each other. It's
Mm.
not always easy, Graham. There's always a lot of different viewpoints to manage, but I work in an incredible organisation with professionals who care deeply about the work that they do. And for the most part, we're very much heading in the same direction.
How do you look after your own self-care?
Well, look, for me, it's about, doing things that bring joy and balance. If I'm talking about outside of work, I love walking the dogs. We've got a Charlie, our cavoodle, and Benson, a bashoodle of sorts, designed a mongrel, really. If I'm honest. They're happiest at the beach chasing a ball, and the time outdoors is grounding for me and my wife too. And look, I think, knowing that and connecting with our kids, staying connected, knowing they're doing well, exercising. My wife Tanya and I, we try to do 2 personal training sessions a week, which is
Oh,
something we do together. And we're both
yeah.
busy people and we don't always get, a lot of time together to do things,
Yeah.
like that. Cooking is another big one. Tanya
Mm.
runs a market gardening business, so we've always got amazing fresh seasonal produce around. So cooking for me is a really good opportunity to shift gears from work to home life. Eating well, doing things that I like doing, staying on top of my physical health. So,
Mm.
seeing the GP or physio when I need to, and checking in on my mental health, including with professional support when I know I need to keep that pendulum in sync. Probably connections as well, Graham.
Mm.
Getting involved in the community. I live in a small coastal town on the east coast of New South Wales called Maria. It's a beautiful community, and sort of getting involved there, and keeping in touch with family and friends, and surrounding myself where possible with people who energize me.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but knowing how to say no to things, Graham, is important too. You can kind of overcommit, and I think sometimes having the ability to say no is a really important self-care strategy.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. And thanks for saying yes to this.
Oh yeah, absolutely, always for you, Graham.
I know you came from, a very large family. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about that and I guess the values you took away from that growing up period?
Yeah, Graham. Look, I've been really lucky. I've got a very large family. There's 13 kids. So I've got 12 siblings, 7 sisters and 5 brothers. We grew up in a noisy and busy household. Mum and dad worked very, very hard to, in mum's case, manage the household. In dad's case, to establish, a career that was able to support the family and, put us all through private school and all that kind of stuff. I don't know how they did it, to be honest.
Amazing, amazing.
We had a good loving family. I mean, we had all the things that go with that many siblings, a lot of teasing. We're the noisiest house in the street. There's factions, there's all sorts of things. But for the most part, or, in every part, we are we're a close family. There's lots of nieces and nephews, and all the complexities that come with a large family. You can probably apply population-based statistics to our family in some. But yeah, I was lucky. I had a very good role model in my late father, my dad Peter, who was a great guy and taught me a lot about respectful relationships, and I often think about dad and think if I could be half the man he is, I'll be doing well.
Yeah, it's great to have a role model like that. I was fortunate also to have a similar, very, very generous, very caring father. And, the more we go on in our work our daily lives, the more you realize that that's not the norm. There's lots of people that have really tough upbringings and don't really have great role models. In that environment, and you had shared previously that you had the tragedy of your brother Damien taking his life, and I'd just like to hear, what your thoughts are now. It's been a while, but I'm sure it's still very painful.
Well, yeah, it's actually was reasonably recent. It's been almost 6 months ago when my brother Damien passed, and yeah, it's a loss that's still very raw, Graham. Having spent so long working in suicide prevention, it brings another layer of, I suppose, reflective complexity to, how, I manage my own, sort of processes and mindset moving forward. In some ways, and I'm actually very okay talking about this. In some ways, Damien, he wasn't doing well for a long time. He was diagnosed with a significant mental health challenge. He was bipolar, and it was bipolar in its extremities. So there were long and sustained periods of depression and not doing well at all. And there were periods of normal, doing well, and there were periods of mania. And the episodes of depression became more sustained, and the episodes of mania became very, very intense. And in some ways it wasn't like he was doing really, really well and then it just happened. It didn't come, it's not like something that came completely out of the blue. The circumstances in which he died were very traumatic for the family, of course, and that's not how we wanted him to go. He had access to resources. He had access to, and many people don't. But as a family, we were able to provide that opportunity for him. But unfortunately, he just didn't feel that he could get better. And yeah, it was very hard to lose him. And we're all in our own way, trying to move forward and deal with it. I've been getting some amazing professional support, and I know without that, I wouldn't be functioning at the level that I am now. So that has really helped me. And you know what? I've been banging on about people getting professional support for most of my career. It's important that I sort of practice what I preach. So,
Definitely.
yeah, thanks for asking, Graham. As I said, I don't mind talking about Damien. I think we need to talk about it. I miss him. I wish it wasn't this way. But, hopefully some of the work that I'm still able to do as a board member of RUOK will help, potentially, stop other families from needing to, to go through this terrible tragedy.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, there's just some things you can't control. There are things entirely outside the realm of your influence. And as you know, I've attempted my life. And when you're in that state, you just think incredibly black and white and just convinced that things will never change. It feels 100% real. And so people are listening out there today, just know that you have it really tough, as Brenna said, get professional help, because that can make a big difference. And just remember that, things can turn around and they can make and you can go on to have a really good life, as I'm fortunate to have now. It's not any fairy tale myth, but, things can turn around and be much, much better.
I agree with that, Graham. And we used to, any chance we get, we would have that conversation with Damien, and many times he believed it. Unfortunately, in the end, life just became too overwhelming for him.
Mm-hmm. I want to jump back now, jumping around a bit, but back to this federated model and holding each other accountable. How do you build that sense of belonging around the group? Is there anything that is consciously done that builds, real robust camaraderie and I guess a shared future for St. John?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we do a lot of work at a leadership, at a federated leadership model in ensuring that we know where we're going, and we've got a really clear and collaborative direction. You know, we're not the kind of organisation as a kind of a national office or licensor of St John brand that kind of pulls out a big stick and says, "Oh, you must do this and you must do that." We focus very much on kind of collaborative decision making and aligning on directional goals, and ultimately getting a commitment on sort of key initiatives that are going to support the communities that we serve. One of the challenges with any federated organisation, Graham, is transition of leadership. So when I started 3.5 years ago, there's only one CEO within that group who's actually still there within the context of that leadership group. But the cultures remain strong, and we've managed to sort of set that and create an environment where we are respectful. We have really good, robust conversations, but we do we do work well together, and we're clear on the direction that we are going. And there's a lot happening, as there always is. And I guess understanding and respecting that all of the states and territories have different businesses and different nuances and different community needs. I mean, if you look at Western Australia and Northern Territory, running a public ambulance service in regional with a strong regional remote area, it's a really complex business.
Yeah.
And you've got to be respectful of making sure that the time that we spend together is time well spent, and that we get focused on what it is that we want to achieve as a federation within the St John context.
Yeah. And in terms of planning for the future, is that done through a facilitated process to work it out what your priority is going to be?
Yeah. So we're strategic in terms of developing our plans. We have a range of touch points, including what we call a federal council, which is when all of our CEOs and board chairs get together. And that's a real engine room for sort of moving, key priorities forward and getting sponsorship at a very senior level so that we can then task our relative, sort of professionals and people to sort of, move forward on key initiatives. One such example would be we've just moved towards a unified national brand, and that's the outcomes of which are profound when you get it right. But it's taken a few years, and you've got to make sure that everyone's moving in the right direction. So we used the forum like Federal Council to make sure that we were continuing to get that sponsorship and support at the highest level, so that we could sort of navigate a major change process.
Very good. For our listeners, would you just give them a quick overview of your career? The last 15 years or so, the groups you've worked with and the role you've had there.
Yeah, for sure. So, look, I started out in communications. Straight out of school, I did a gap year in the UK, and then I studied a communications degree at University of Canberra. And I spent the early part of my career in brand and agency land. So my last role as a brand strategist in an agency in Canberra led me to Lifeline, National Crisis Support Helpline, which I'm sure all Australians would be familiar with. Mm. And I was working as a brand strategist at the agency to help Lifeline with the national rebrand. And ultimately, that project kind of changed everything in terms of the trajectory of my career. I joined them in 2007, so the brand project wrapped up, and the CEO at the time, Dawn O'Neill, invited me over to step into the community sector. And I actually started the role in setting up a national cannabis helpline. So I had to deal with builders and telcos I had no idea what I was doing, by the way. It was a foot in the door. And then I moved into role establishing the national fundraising function. Again, no idea what I was doing. And, it taught me a lot, actually, Lifeline. Dawn was a great leader, one of the most authentic leaders I've known, Dawn O'Neill, the CEO. There was a lot in there about my career becoming purposeful and finding something that I was passionate about. I mean, 2009 was a turning point. I was part of helping to coordinate Lifeline's submission into a Senate inquiry into suicide in Australia. And it really changed the needle moved the needle with respect to getting suicide prevention on the national agenda, and was probably the moment that I shifted from having a job to having a vocation. Yeah. And that was an amazing 7 years. And at the end of that, we had a bit of a restructure. I had an opportunity to move on, and I took that opportunity with the encouragement of our board chair at the time, John Brogden. That was great advice. And after sort of, flapping around for a few months, not knowing what I wanted to do, I got a call up to have an interview with Are You OK, Graham? And that's where our paths crossed in 2013. And I got the job. I still lived in Canberra, so I had to commute a few days a week. And, it was an amazing small team. I think there were 4 people. And as you know, they were still finding their feet after the loss of the founder of AUOK, Gavin Larkin, who had passed away in 2011. Yeah. So, look, the early days were pretty tough at AUOK. You'd remember, Graham, we were under-resourced. We had a couple of major partnerships that were coming to a natural conclusion. And, I suppose I'd sold myself on my credentials of being able to sort of set up partnerships, which I'd done very well at Lifeline. But it took us a little while. It was a fairly tough few months, but we ultimately landed a couple of big ones with Hungry Jackson Virgin Mobile from memory. And it was the start of, 6 years, probably 6 of the most incredible years of my career, which I contributed to assisting to help us continue to grow into one of Australia's most recognised mental health campaigns.
Yeah, it was an unbelievable time. And in fact, I think we even touched base in 2009 when Gavin and I came to Canberra and launched the very, very first Are You OK? I think you were there, right?
I was certainly there, yep. I'd been invited to this launch. I think Nicola Roxon was the health minister, because this guy, Gavin Larkin, had just kind of landed in the space. He had this campaign called Are You OK Day, and we were like, who is this guy? Where's this come from? The sector are up in arms. The government had just given them money, and, there's no evidence. Anyway, there was a huge amount of evidence, and that was Gavin's lived experience. And I remember at Lifeline, we decided very quickly to get alongside Gavin, with respect to ensuring that there was an on-ramp to our crisis support service, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, it was, who'd have known at that time that, 4 or 5 years later, I'd be in a key leadership role with RUOK, and I'm very grateful that I met Gav, because that was the first and only time that I met him.
And it was an extraordinary day. Like, as you might recall, of that launch, there was a lot of media there. There really was. And we thought, oh, this is going to be fantastic. We'll be all over everywhere. Get back to Sydney, get to the news. And apparently, well, some dog got stuck down a mine in the Hunter Valley. And all the news stations kept crossing to this bloody dog there. So it wasn't, for a first one, it was fantastic. But based on everyone there, we thought it was going to be huge.
There's a nice little pun in there, Graham. Are you okay, 9?
Yeah,
That's what I'm with the dog.
exactly. Looking back over the period, because, when you did join, things weren't great. We didn't have big money coming in. We'd had, lost a sponsor or two. And with yourself and Catherine Newton after you, it's become something quite extraordinary, for something that only started in 2009. What do you think are the key elements that led to it being the success it has been?
Look, whilst, obviously I was there during a significant period of growth and development, I will be at pains to say that I inherited an amazing organization. It was, it was just such a strong brand. And I guess in some areas it might have needed a little bit of sunshine and fertilizer around things like, partnerships, and perhaps focusing on really strengthening our resources and thinking about succession. And, when there were 4 people there to start off with. But look, I think fundamentally the key thing that contributed to its success was RUOK always maintained a really tight lane. They knew who they were and what they weren't, and they never once, they really stayed in that lane. And they said it, we said it, and said it again. We were focused on empowering people to have a conversation with someone they're worried about. And we were very true to that purpose, and we remained true to Gav's purpose. I also think the connection of RUOK as a movement to Gavin and to the Larkin family, and their story, which came from a place of lived experience with the death of Gavin's father Barry in the 1990s. People could really relate to that. And, the simplicity of RUOK, the fact that we didn't ask you to do anything other than to pick up our resources and promote the value and the profound impact that a conversation can make in keeping someone connected. We didn't ask people for money. We just asked them to get involved. People still gave us money, which was great, because you've got to keep the lights on. But yeah, that level of simplicity and the work that we did in ensuring that we've got a good underpinning evidence base in evaluating the campaigns and program gave us the credibility, I think, that we needed in the sector to really see RUOK become a really respected player in the mental health and suicide prevention space.
Yeah. Funnily enough, I'm just finished first draft of a new book I'm doing for Wiley, which is called Great Leaders Care. And part of that, I've got a red zone care section and talk about the history of RUOK and what were the key elements that led to its success. And really very, very similar to what you've just described. I think the other thing was, and of course we had Gavin's story, but we came to have many, many stories, and those stories magnified the impact, those authentic stories, and they still are the biggest reason for change. And the other thing that I think was significant is because we had no money, everything was digital to start with, all the resources, the videos, the social media, everything. So we started off as like a digital native charity. And I think that was a big contributor because, social media now is taken over from, mainstream media. And that's really, really produced something special, which I think we're all very, very proud of.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
With regards to involving people in a shared future, whether it's where you are now or RUOK or your time at Movember, What do you think is key to that, to getting people to really grow together?
Look, I think partly it's about, genuine consultation and involvement when we're talking about shared future. So if we want, like, I think if I want the people in my team, the organization I'm with, to feel like they're part of the journey, then they actually need to help us shape the plan and not just be handed one. That means, it also means that our strategy or plan needs to be dynamic, not set in stone. So we have to continually be providing input and assessing. I mean, we live in a really dynamic world. You look at things like, the emergence of technology and AI, things are changing at such a rapid rate. We can't set and forget. So we need to revisit our plan, which will shape our shared future regularly and make sure that our actions are aligned with it. We've also got to stay in our lane. I spoke about this in respect to Are You OK? Like when I was running Are You OK as CEO, there were lots of tempting rabbit holes, especially when funding opportunities came up. You might have a corporate that said, "Look, we've got $500,000. We want to, contribute to Are You OK?" Which would have solved a lot of our funding problems at the time. Let's come up with a new idea. I'm like, well, we don't actually need a new idea. We need some petrol in the tank to drive the idea that we are committed to. And so staying true to your mission and I suppose that same discipline, now applies to St. John. St. John as it did when I was at Movember. I had a few years at Movember. And I kind of always reinforce, certainly to myself and to the team, if what we're doing doesn't align with our mission and vision or our strategy, we shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah.
Stop doing it. And that clarity helps to build trust. I guess helps keep us focused and hopefully, maintains that shared sense of purpose across the team.
Yeah. When you look at your role as a leader now, who's been the big influences on you? Is it people, or is it books or videos, or what are the things that have really impacted Brendan Maher's leadership?
That's a really good question as well. I think obviously, families had a huge influence on me and the people that I work with have a massive influence, particularly people that if I think about, certain boards that I've worked with, one of which was Are You OK, Graham, and you were there for my whole tenure. And I actually remember having a conversation with Mike Conahan, who is the foundational board chair of Are You OK and is still there. And he once said to me, if you want to be a good leader, model the traits that you've admired in others. And this advice has kind of stuck with me. I've worked with some incredible leaders. I mentioned, Dawn O'Neill at Lifeline. In terms of influence, when I see, sort of good behavior or something that inspires me, I try and think, how can I take something out of that into the way that I interact with my people? If I take Dawn, for example, right? So she was my first CEO in the community sector. Lifeline, as an organisation, was federated, but there were 26 member boards to corral. And Dawn was this person who, and I hope she doesn't mind me talking about her. I'll send her a copy. She was one of these people that led with grace, but and a rare balance of sort of toughness and compassion. So she took a genuine interest in people. She gave people opportunities, including me, whilst at the same time she was telling me there was a role I applied for in the senior leadership team, and she sat me down and said, "I don't think you're ready, but throw your hat in the ring." And she gave me an opportunity to act in it, and I eventually got the gig, which was amazing. But she was also someone who stood beside her team when things didn't go to plan. I remember missing a major fundraising target once because, as I told you earlier, I had no idea about fundraising. And instead of distancing herself, she stood in front of me, and that kind of leadership gave me a lot of insight. Because it's kind of like when your team, when your leaders are doing well as a CEO, you're doing well. You just need to focus on lifting them up and reinforcing and celebrating successes, because as a leader, you get that kudos anyway, because if the organization is doing well, you have your performance review however many times you have a board meeting. That's the truth. Every board meeting is a performance review, really. But also, with Dawn, for instance, it was about sort of that whole values alignment. So Dawn was someone who carried Lifeline's values: compassion, empathy, care, resilience. It was all reflected in her behavior. And I think that's what great leadership is. It's not perfection. I mean, you're never going to get the full package from anyone, whatever that is. So it doesn't exist. But Dawn gave presence, and she also surrounded herself with talented people who were empowered, and they were better at their particular craft than Dawn was, and she acknowledged that. And that's my philosophy as well. All of my leaders are far better at their area of expertise than I'll ever be, and that's not a threat. It's actually the point.
Yeah.
So
yeah. There's some great insights there. Have you ever had a big setback in your career? Challenge?
Yeah, look, sure. There's been failures. I've missed the mark on things. You might have handled things where not handled things well. The thing that I find really, really hard in this job is when structural change happens in this job and any job, and it results in good people needing to be off ramped because of the budget constraints or a change in direction. I really feel that, and I suppose there, in the early part of my career, there might have been ways that I've handled, some of those processes and conversations that I would do differently now. So look, setback, possibly when I left Lifeline and I had that period of I guess a little hiatus between Lifeline and Are You OK? It took me a little longer to sort of find my next step, and I started sort of questioning myself about whether I'd pigeonholed myself into the wrong place. Should I have left the commercial world? Did I have any value to employers? That period was hard, but kind of I don't think like that anymore. I probably wouldn't be as bold now that I'm almost 50 to leave a job without having another job, unless I'm retiring or doing something different. But yeah, look, I've been pretty lucky. I've worked with some amazing people, and I've always felt really supported by the boards that I've worked with. And there's always a power imbalance with a board and a CEO, right? But I've always felt like I've worked with really amazing people, and I feel very lucky. I've had a great career, and I've been able to do meaningful work. And right now I'm working for an incredible organisation that does incredible work for the Australian community, and every day's a blessing, including with the team that I am so lucky to work alongside and admire and respect.
Brilliant. You shared before we came on air that you really loved Patch Adams' movie. Why does that really resonate with you?
Look, Patch Adams is just one of those underrated movies. I think that when people say to me, "Oh, what's your favourite movie?" Most people will say The Shawshank Redemption, or that one comes up regularly. It just stayed with me for so long, and Robin Williams was just such an amazing actor, and it had everything, like humor, it had heart, it was inspiring, and it was also based on a true story. So Hunter Adams, or Patch, that Robin Williams played, was a medical student, and he moved out of the sort of clinical mindset into focusing on the role that connection plays in healing, and he challenged the kind of system by showing that people aren't just cases or conditions; they're humans who need to be seen, heard, and cared for. And that it just made me feel so good, that movie, and I could watch it every day of the week, Graham. And it's a reminder to me that sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer someone is our presence and connection, like a laugh, a conversation, a moment of empathy, a knowing glance, a hand on the shoulder. It all matters. And if you haven't seen Patch Adams, it'll be on Netflix or one of those. Just have a look, because it's a great movie.
Fabulous. And I also shared that through just pure luck, I came to see Robin Williams perform at a comedy club in Los Angeles. And
Amazing.
it was the end of the night. He came in as a surprise entry, and he just blew everyone away. It was just like you see on YouTube or other places. His stuff goes a million miles an hour, his mind was. And along the way, he worked out that my colleague was a Kiwi. And anyway, we were walking out the door at the end, and he was there, and he called us over. And so we had about a 10-minute chat with him, and he was incredibly engaging. And, it did send shockwaves around the world when he took his life. In fact, it was my book, Back from the Brink, I launched in the US about 2 weeks after, and I had all these media interviews organized all in the US, talk back, but it was all anyone could talk about was just what a positive impact. You know, he had lots of really great movies that move people. Dead Poets Society, and lots and lots of other ones. He really made a massive impact. And he had a sign or a saying that essentially was, be kind, everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle you know nothing about. And it's such a great message, isn't it, to really think about? Because the reality is that's the truth.
It's so true.
It is the truth, yeah. It's been absolutely fantastic catching up, Brendan. Really enjoyed just going through your background, your career, and what shaped you. Look back now and, being with all the wisdom, the hard knocks, the success, what advice would you give your 20-year-old self if you had the opportunity to advise? And then this is the other part, the 20-year-old self listen.
You probably wouldn't. Look, my advice would be pretty simple, I think. If your ladder's leaning up against the wrong wall, move it to a better spot. And I think that probably applies to work, to career, to relationships, really any part of life. I mean, it doesn't mean that you should run away at the first sign of discomfort. Of course not. But it means, you should pause and ask, is this giving me the stability I need? Is this situation helping me grow? Is this the right view? Do I need to get higher? Sometimes we find ourselves climbing really hard, pushing forward, only to realize we're kind of treading water or not heading somewhere that aligns with our values or purpose, or we're just really not happy. And I think that's when it's worth reassessing. So not abandoning the climb, but finding a better footing, being intentional, and making sure the effort that you're putting in is taking you somewhere meaningful. Look, 18 when I was 18 or 20 years old, Graham, that seems like yesterday, and that's 30 years ago. And time flies. And I'm grateful that I don't feel like I've wasted, too much of that opportunity. But move that ladder. If it's not in the right spot, move it. Reassess. Find the spot that works and makes you happy and gives you meaning. I suppose I'd say. Yeah,
I love that. I love that. And I think also Stephen Covey talked a lot about that as well in terms of purpose and guidance and what you're striving for. And it's just no good if you're pointing in the wrong direction. It's just not going to be fulfilling and right for you.
And, you've got to be courageous sometimes. I mean, taking calculated risks, whilst it might be uncomfortable for a period of time, like, leaving a job without another one, there's real opportunity in what some of that risk can provide in terms of a mindset shift or maybe an opportunity to completely think about doing something different. I would never have seen myself working in the community sector after, stewarding my way through advertising agencies. I thought I'd be a burnt out ad man now if I was still in there, I can tell you right now. But it gave me an opportunity that I jumped on because I saw the opportunity to work with someone who I really respected, and I've never looked back. It's been an incredible journey. I'm very grateful.
Thanks for being part of the Caring CEO and all for the great work you're doing, Brendan. You continue to do it, and it's an absolute pleasure to catch up again.
Likewise, Graham. Always enjoy catching up, and I hope people listening get something meaningful out of this or an insight or something. And I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for asking me.
No worries.